thank you everybody for joining us at this time. Michael, thank you for being with us tonight. Spasibo большое. Let's start at a very good place at the very beginning. What was it like growing up Jewish in Belarus?
Oh, it was easy, bud. Um, Growing up was easy. Growing up Jewish in Belarus, maybe not so much. Good evening, everyone. I am really grateful to be here. Thank you, Joey, for the wonderful opportunity, and Bud for the conversation. As I was reminiscing a little earlier, Bud and I met in '95, and I think there's a picture somewhere of the two of us sitting there on the windowsill, and me carefully writing down all the chords to Jewish music that Bud was sharing with me, and I very much appreciate the friendship and this opportunity to reconnect. And of course, Zhenya, such an honor to be doing something together with you tonight. Growing up in Belarus, there was such a thing as the Soviet Jewish childhood. It was secular. It involved your Jewish identity not hidden, because you can't really hide it. It's everywhere. It's demanded of you everywhere, but not as an identity, but as a nationality, or what we would call in English ethnicity. You can't take a book out of a library. I remember as an 8-year-old walking into a library and you want to take a book and you have to write that you're Jewish. And you have to do this not once, but every time you do this. The teacher opens the journal on trying to figure out who's going to be called out to the blackboard to respond to questions of today's lesson. And of course, right there is your name and your nationality. It's everywhere. Mm-hmm. And of course, if you're Russian or Ukrainian or Belarusian, I suppose, what does it matter? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. No one pays much attention. But if you're Jewish, it matters a lot. And so you form your identity based on these experiences. Of who you are and how do you relate to the world out there, but perhaps more importantly, how the world out there relates to you.
Because it's actually on your internal passport. I remember it was called, I think, what, Piati Punkt? The fifth
that
point?
Is correct, you see.
And that's why those of us who went in the 70s and then actually in the 90s too, but mostly early on, who would use the phrase Ruski Yevrei or Sovietsky Yevrei, Russian Jew, Soviet Jew, as we used in English, we got looks over there like, no, you can't be both. It's you're one or the other, and so it's actually on your internal passport. Yes,
that is correct. It used to be, and in fact, one of the things, and that's I think the difference between growing the country in which I grew up and the countries into which the Soviet Union disintegrated, was that most of the countries, one of the first things that have transpired was they removed the so-called fifth line from the passport, that they have in fact removed the nationality. Zhenya, correct me if I'm wrong, the Ukrainian doesn't carry it, the Belarusian passport doesn't carry it anymore.
Absolutely right, 100%.
And so one of the interesting things in the post-Soviet countries was the fact that suddenly the Jewish identity that was partially maintained by this outside pressure was now, it didn't disappear, but it was partially removed. And so when I came back to St. Petersburg in 2004 to work as a rabbi, suddenly I was dealing with a generation of people who chose to be Jewish or didn't choose to be Jewish. No one, the society wasn't constantly reminding them that they were, whether they liked it or not. So in that respect, it felt very much like my work as a rabbi in the West, that there was really, in that regard, that really was no difference. It was a profound transformation from the way in which I grew up and the reality in which most of the Jews in Russia, Belarus, or Ukraine, or beyond, operate today.
Before we get to that, as the changes start to happen in what was still the Soviet Union with Glasnost and Perestroika in the late 80s, is there a moment you can recall when all of a sudden it was okay to publicly be Jewish or to observe, and things had started to change even before the country comes to an end in 1991?
I think this is a great question. I think I wonder whether it is because it becomes okay, or whether it becomes okay for you to experience this.
Mm-hmm.
My brother in 1990 was able to attend a Jewish program in London. It was unheard of back then, and he came back, and one of the things he brought back was a silver Magen David, and he knew that I would really want one, and so somebody gave him one, and he came and brought it for me, and I was so excited to have it and to wear it. And so we had gym class. I was maybe 16, and I had it on, and we were running, whatever we were doing, and it came up from underneath my shirt and landed on top of my shirt. And I would not have done so on purpose, not in the general sense. Maybe in the gathering of other Jews, this was a sense of pride. But in the outside, you really, really didn't want to push your luck. And I was talking to my teacher at the time, who was actually my gym teacher was a lovely guy, and he was big into music, and so he found a kindred soul. And whenever I was really out of breath, he would then stand and talk to me about music. And so he walked up to me, and it was awkward for him. He was trying to be sensitive, and he said, Michael, he was trying to find the ways to say, it's going. And I looked at him and I smiled and I said, I know. And he said, okay, then. So I think, but I wonder whether this was the fact that it was now allowed, or the fact that I have arrived at a point where, for me, this was possible. And so many of the Jews of my generation remember, but I know that you're a big maven of various Russian music. So in the late 80s, in a televised concert on Central Television, Alexander Rosenbaum, who was at the time on the peak of his career, was performing with an open collar shirt and a Magen David out there. I remember being stunned. Many of us exchanged that story as, do you remember seeing this? And going, wow, is it really possible? So yes, perestroika and the gradual collapse and the disintegration was both the time when it was allowed to come to the surface, and when many of us, not all, have begun to experience it. I just happened to be growing up. I happened to be a teenager right as all of this was happening. So I happened to be in the right place at the right time, where I still remember the tough parts, but I also got a lot of excitement of being able to embrace and engage with this.
The changes that were happening were hard to grasp for all of us. I recall going back in 1992 as part of the World Union of Progressive Judaism for a conference that was similar to the one where we met each other in 1995. And the woman who picked me up at the airport, or at least in the cab, a woman named Masha Rabiner from Chelyabinsk, and she was explaining to me in Russian and loudly how she had been to Israel that summer and had a wonderful time. And my head was still in 1979. And I think the cabbie is going to pull us over to the side of the road. And I am whispering back to her, are you allowed to say, is this okay? And she looks at me like, is there a problem? It's okay now. We can talk about this now. And we held this conference and held services and song sessions in a public place where there were other groups, and they listened to us, and it obviously was different. Before we get to trying to understand what's happening now, when you go off to school in London, at Leo Beck, yes, in London, is the idea, I'm going to be a rabbi and I will go back to the former Soviet Union? Or is there a notion of, well, I'm in the West, I might want to stay in the West?
Well, so first of all, I want to acknowledge the fact that while his camera is off, Rabbi Mark Weiner is also here tonight. He is my friend, my mentor, my senior rabbi at one point, and really an extended family member. And so part of the deal was I really wanted to be a rabbi, and Leo Beck College very, very smartly and very generously has figured out that there were others before me, and there were others, thankfully, after me as well, And they have figured out a way to raise money and bring these people who I had no idea. If I would have had to navigate that part of it, of making arrangements and figure out the money, I would have never made it because I just simply did not know. It was a completely different world. But they would take, most years, they took one student from the former Soviet Union. And part of the deal was you then come back and you work for the World Union for Progressive Judaism. And if you're asking me personally, I was never particularly eager or looking forward to being to going back and living in the former Soviet Union. I have at an early enough age realized that that was not where I wanted to spend the rest of my life. But I felt honored to go back and do this work, and I have returned and served in St. Petersburg for 3 years. We built a beautiful community and a beautiful synagogue. Watching from afar the reality of what goes on, not just in Ukraine but also in Russia right now, is tough. But I was honored to do this, as did a great many. Most of the students did go back. Some for a period of time, and others are still there working in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia, serving the communities there.
So let's bring it to today, and at the risk of asking an obvious question, is you with someone with family and friends in Belarus, in Ukraine, in Russia?
Almost no family, but many friends who are like family.
In those three countries?
Correct.
So what is it like to watch this, knowing that you have friends in all three of these countries?
I wrote something about 24 hours after this war broke out, and I felt I couldn't go to bed. I needed to write something down, and I've shared it with friends, and I said that it's been like being in the fog. I don't know if I'm in the fog anymore, but that shock and that pain and the utter disbelief that you experience is palpable. I know that we are all shocked. Perhaps I'm just as shocked as everybody else. Maybe there's also a higher degree of this relation. I'm not just thinking about a country and the people who are suffering and struggling with 2 million refugees already. I mean, it's just unthinkable. But I'm also trying to reach out to friends and former students and colleagues, and attending Shabbat services that Rabbi Duchovny led out of a bomb shelter out of Kiev. It's that kind of surreal stuff that takes a lot out of you, and you do feel a little bit in the haze. And I've also realized in the days since that in reaching out, I'm reaching out simultaneously to people in all of those three places that you have named. But the conversation is very different because I am checking in with friends in Ukraine to see whether some are still in Ukraine, others have left, some have relocated internally, and it is a terrifying set of communications. Are you alive? There's nothing I can help with, but I can offer at least words of support, just checking in. And then checking in with friends in Belarus, and especially friends in Russia, and checking in, how are you doing? Their worlds, there's no bombs falling on them, but their world is imploding and the Iron Curtain is shutting down at a speed that I don't think any of us have seen. It is terrifying. I reached out to one of the colleagues today and I said, how are you doing? And instead of replying, he forwarded me today an article from Novaya Gazeta, which is pretty much the only independent source of news that for now remains open in Russia, whose chief editor was just awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last year, Dmitry Muratov. And the article talks about the priest somewhere in the middle of Russia, in the middle of nowhere, in a small village. He preached a sermon in which he did not say anything other than he quoted, "Do not murder." He quoted one of the 10 commandments. By the time he made it home, he got a phone call that he had to show up to police, and he was arraigned, and he will have to face some kind of consequences. And this was an interview with this priest. So how do you, the country that has either existed or existed in aspirations is imploding as we speak. So it's a different kind of concern, and all of these messages are flying through, and none of it is easy.
Is there even a part of it? I mean, I understand, we all understand or want to understand, and are learning about what people are going through in Ukraine, both those who are there and those who have left, and fortunately, made it to safety. But the story, and it's not a story easily told, because we've seen what's happened to journalists of late, both Russian and foreign journalists in Russia. The story of people, it's so intermixed, for want of a better term, that story of the Jews in Russia now, I'm almost curious, when you get in touch with them, is there a part of you is like, should I even be in touch with them? Will that be dangerous for them? Are we at that point, going back even to, like the Stalin years, where even a mere connection to a Westerner might be a problem?
So I think that, but I apologize, I'm going to throw you under the bus here a little. As we were starting, you mentioned something about technology, and you claimed that you were still in '79 and learning to come into the '80s. I think technology tells a lot of the story today. So, for example, while I worry about friends who are hiding out in bomb shelters in Ukraine, I can still send them messages via Facebook, and they respond via Facebook, as long as they have power and they have internet. And remember, it's a horrendous war zone in most of the places that we're seeing, but it's a war zone from which people have direct means of communicating, and they don't have to worry about what it is that they're saying. What is happening with friends who are in Russia is that you are migrating to new apps, new platforms, Telegram, and now Signal. There are these apps that work with little or almost no internet, that they utilize a different kind of technology so that it can be safer and that you can, in fact, remain in touch. And WhatsApp and Facebook may or may not be accessible. So I don't know if it's quite the same as what you're implying, but I think that technology actually tells that story, that you see people migrating. And what's also remarkable, especially for me, because I am kind of, I'm not lost in all these words, but I do have a foot in each one of these worlds. That's what was happening with Belarus. The migration to some of these platforms for communication had to take place over the last 2 years, as people in Belarus were stuck, crushed by the brutality of the regime. So if you wanted to keep in touch, you had to rely on some other means. Otherwise, you can easily be disconnected. Now it's moving on to Russia. But of course, all of this is just the Jewish part of the story, is the anticipation of what's coming next. Ukraine, the worry, we're looking at it, and it is what's happening now, and it is tragic, and it is painful, and I don't think that any of us have ever met, even the most hardened and the most cynical of us, who say, yeah, of course the governments will always do what they do. I don't think that we ever could imagine that that level of brutality in the 21st century war.
I want to encourage everyone who's watching to please put your questions in the chat, because we will have a lot of time for your questions in the chat. Michael is there, and we're going to hear from Zhenya a bit later on in the program, and her music, which is beautiful. And we welcome you to the United States, and we welcome you to New York. Michael, is there something about these places, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, that even for those of us who went and spoke the language a little bit and had those experiences in the small apartments and talking quietly about life there, life for everyone, life for Jews who keep up with what's going on there even before the war, is there something that those of us who did not grow up there just don't understand about that region of the world, both before the war and now during this war.
You know, but the older I get, the more I realize that even though we may claim to understand certain things that others don't understand, the older I get, the more I realize that maybe none of us really understand what we claim to understand. I will, however, tell you a phenomenal exchange I had with with a former congregant in London who sent me a link to this video. Some of you may have already seen it. We shared it actually with our religious school students this afternoon. It is a video of a little girl in a bomb shelter in what appears to be Kiev, although I'm not 100% certain, who is, the bomb shelter is filled with people of every age, from tiny babies to elderly, and people clearly are living in that bomb shelter. And this little girl who, I don't know, she can't be more than 8. She is going to sing something and entertain, and her parents are filming this. And she beautifully sings Let It Go.
Mm-hmm.
And she sings Let It Go in Russian. So my friend sends me this video, and I say, did you notice how there is a Ukrainian flag on the wall and the girl is singing in Russian, and it's a Russian translation, like a fully translated Let It Go in Russian everywhere. And my friend said, wait a second, what do you mean? Why is she singing in Russian in a Ukrainian bomb shelter?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, aha, we have a lot of work to do. So when you say, is there something that perhaps is missing? I think one of the things that you may not see if you're just watching the translation, news in translation, is the fact that half of Ukraine, and I apologize if my percentage, Zhenya may probably correct me if my percentage is off, but like half of Ukraine is Russian speaking. Mm-hmm. In many of these videos, in many of these cities, I know Zhenya is from Kharkiv, right? It is a Russian speaking city. Kiev, at least more than half of Kiev is Russian speaking. I lived in Kiev for 2 years. I don't speak Ukrainian. I mean, I understand it. I can certainly, but it is entirely President Zelensky. His native language is Russian. His comedy show and everything else was in Russian. He has now switched almost exclusively to Ukrainian, as far as I can tell. But that's also, he is trying to rally the country to stand up to an aggressor. But culturally speaking, all of these people, or at least half of these people that are bravely standing in the streets and with their bare hands pushing against the tanks, something that I'd like to think that I can sustain emotion. I have to turn away and I cry. I cannot fathom what this means, both for people who are pushing back against these tanks with their bare hands, and for the 19-year-olds that are driving these tanks without knowing who they are and where they are and why they're there. All of it is this profound tragedy. But what is remarkable is that people standing on the streets and pushing back are yelling in Russian, I am Russian. This is my land. What are you doing here? You have to leave. You are bringing destruction to me. Now, all of that gets lost because Ukraine is Ukrainian. Not every Ukrainian is a Ukrainian nationalist. And in fact, I think part of the current conflict, or at least part of what has been pushed forward, is the fact that, well, there are Russian speakers who are being assaulted or abused or whatever else it is by Ukrainian nationalists whose rights are being taken away. But what you see instead is that after 30 years of modern Ukraine with various levels of challenges, from economic to cultural to everything imaginable, right? It's not that things are easy. But what I'm seeing is that all of the Ukrainians, no matter what, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Jewish, they're all embracing Ukrainian national idea, the sovereignty of Ukraine as a country, which is their country and the one that they are prepared to fight for and that they don't want to see changed in the name of whatever it may be. And that, I think, I don't know whether this is something that's easy to pick up or to really internalize. To me, this has been one of the most remarkable things about watching this conflict and how the ideologues in the Kremlin have clearly got this wrong.
Right. And the notion that just because someone in Ukraine speaks Russian as their first language doesn't mean that they want to be ruled by Vladimir Putin. Not even close.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Not even close.
As the Israelis like to say in the times when I've visited Israel, about just about any question, it's complicated. Let's take some of your questions from the chat, and then we will get to Zhenya and Zhenya, your music. One of the questions is, what do your boys who came to the USA as children, who spoke no English at the time, think about the situation, and how does that differ? I assume this is from someone who knows you personally. And how does that differ from you and Olga, who grew up in Belarus and Ukraine?
Olga, you want to answer that?
I can try. Thank you. Thank you for the question. So we have two boys. One is 21 years old and another one is senior in high school. Sam, who is at Tufts right now, in his third year, one of his majors is in Eastern European studies that includes Russian language. So he called us a few days ago. So emotional, he couldn't even speak. So he talked about the enormous guilt that he is feeling right now, focusing on studying Russian as a language and Russian culture, as this country is being this aggressor in the world, bringing hatred and evil. And it took a number of conversations and a quick visit from Michael to calm him down a little. And we talked about the fact that being Russian speakers is a big part of our identity. It's who we are. And giving up Russian, being the language of millions of those who are fighting for their life and their country in Ukraine today, is not the right thing to do. And feeling guilt for being, part of that culture feels really wrong. So both of our boys are following the news, giving us the updates, listening to our favorite Ukrainian rock group, Okean Elze, these days, following the news. And as an employee of the Jewish Federations of North America, I'm working on a number of initiatives helping the crisis in Ukraine. So I mentioned one of those possible projects of organizing volunteers mission to go to the borders and help there. So both of them said, can I go? Mom, please, can you put me in that group? So they are not Ukrainians, they are not Russians. They were born in London, they grew up in the United States. But these days, they realize that this part of them is there. It's still home, and it's very difficult to watch what's happening from afar. And being a stranger, they don't feel as strangers watching what's unfolding in front of our eyes.
Can I imagine that, and as a parent myself, can I imagine that is a conversation, the conversation you had with your son that you referenced, that is a conversation you thought you would never have to have with him? The notion of him feeling shame about his ancestry.
Absolutely, Budd. Absolutely. And Russian to me is the language of my grandpa, stories of the wartime where he fought. It's the language of my mom's lullabies. It's the language of engravings on their tombstones in the Jewish cemetery in Kiev. I am not gonna give it up. This is part of who I am. So I never thought this would be, there would be times to have this kind of conversations, not with my children, not with my friends or colleagues. As community, I think Russian-speaking Jewish communities getting somewhat divided along those lines as well these days.
And Bud, the second part of this conversation, thank you so much, Olga, that is that we are, well, you're talking to a rabbi and a Jewish educator, right? We're in the business of identity forming. And of course, we spend our entire lives trying to figure out how to impart all of these parts of our identities and how to pass them on to our kids and how to have them embrace them as meaningful. The Jewish part, the Russian part, language, culture, understanding. I am still bereft that there's virtually no Ashkenazi food that they can relate to. They don't like gefilte fish. How can you not? Okay, never mind. I said my piece, but of course.
That's a whole nother conversation.
It's a betrayal, it's a betrayal. But the point is, although I see their point, the interesting thing is, growing up as they did, of course they listen to the stories, and as kids do, you listen. Some of it goes into one ear and goes out the other, and you cannot really impart identity just by telling them that they should have this identity. And so at one point, I think we both have become, we had to accept the fact that they know that their parents maybe come from Belarus and Ukraine, but I don't think that they've ever really paid much attention to this. But when events began to unfold in Belarus, our son called me from college and said, "Do you think you can get me a Belarusian flag? I want to put it on the wall." Right? Suddenly, I'm not just watching this as a conflict afar, but I'm also watching this as a conflict in the place, which is somehow weirdly resonating with me and is connected. And now the events in Ukraine are further opening this up. So truth is, I wish that it was only through positive experiences. We haven't had a chance to take them back as adults, and we kept thinking about it. I wish that this development of identity happened in more positive terms, but it is very clear that when things like that happen, they trigger identity growth and development in ways that maybe you couldn't predict.
You can play those Akujava albums a lot.
Oh, they do. It's funny because we sometimes, when they play this Spotify list, and suddenly there is Vysotsky or Akujava that comes on, and I go in the middle of whatever else it is that they're listening to, but that's it. It is part of something that they're trying to keep as part of their identity as well.
Musicians who were, correct me if I'm wrong, beloved throughout the former Soviet Union, not just in Russia or in Ukraine or in Belarus or Georgia. Everybody loved Akujava. Everybody loved Wysotsky. Yes?
Right. Yeah. And still do.
Yeah. I am supposed to do an event in June. We're singing the songs of Bulat Akujava, and that's going to be a tough needle to thread at this point. The notion of, and in fact, I've written something where I kind of wondered, and this, for people who don't know, this is a beautiful musician who really came of age in the late 50s and during the cultural thaw after the death of Joseph Stalin, and his words, his music, absolutely beloved throughout the former Soviet Union, and every time I've performed them, it seems to bring a smile to people's faces, and that's not about my music, my musical talent. That's about the power of this music, and I kind of wonder, what would Bulat Akujava be singing tonight as he watches his country do what it's doing, although he actually was of Armenian and Georgian descent, interestingly. We have another question in the chat, which is more a political question, not so much about your personal experiences, and that question is, despite nuclear weapons being in the equation, is it moral to let the slaughter go on? I'm not quite sure how you answer that.
Well, I'm glad that it comes from a congregant, so people putting me on the spot. I think that I have found myself in the midst of what I can only describe as hubris, passing on judgments and making decisions and aspirations, and then 2 weeks ago, all of that came to a halt. So the answer, I would say, is there's nothing moral about letting slaughter go on. I don't think that morality can even begin to describe this. the question, it's not about morality is present, but it is more of a trolley dilemma, right? What action is going to bring even more devastation and more death? How do you navigate that? And so I don't have anything to offer in that regard. I understand the question, but I don't know if I can offer anything of meaning.
Before we transition over back to Rabbi Hessel and to Zhenya, for both of you, Olga and Michael, if there's anything that we have not addressed that is important to you, again, that something, an experience from the past or currently that might shed even more light on your thoughts of what you're going through right now, I give you the floor for a few more minutes.
I do have one thing that I wanted to add. I was asked to speak to students of the Leo Baeck School in Toronto earlier today, to 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, and they were asking questions, and they asked, "What can we do? How do you evolve?" And in responding to that question, I suddenly realized that there is an additional piece that we need to consider, especially as Jews. When something happens in the world aimed at us, we feel so acutely when others who are living next to us don't understand how all of the Jews are interconnected, don't really understand that whatever goes on in Colleyville, Texas, is making all of us stop where we are. And many of our neighbors don't get it, right? Because they live in the world that's a little different. But we get it. So I think one of the things that I want to add is Ukrainians, we have a long and complicated history, we the Jews, with Ukrainian nationalism. And there's actually a lot being written about it right now. And you can certainly go and have a look. And suffice it to say that Khmelnytsky massacres before the Holocaust have been the largest event of the loss of Jewish life and the most devastating one. And that was one of the Ukrainian national uprisings that was aimed at Russians and Poles, but who also got the brunt of it? It was the Jews. So I do understand all of this. And yet, right now, there are Ukrainians living all around us, no matter where we are. New York, New Haven, Canada, you name it. There are large or small Ukrainian diasporas everywhere. And right now, they are hurting in the way that just watching these conversations unfold, they are palpably hurting. I went to there was a little event on New Haven Green on Sunday in support of Ukraine, organized by some of the local community and politicians, and I stood there, and people stood there and listened to some politician speeches and other things. It was all very nice. And then suddenly, in the middle of it all, this woman standing behind us just was talking to someone standing next to her and just broke down and started crying. And that's the kind of a thing that I walked over to the priest whom I've never met. I introduced myself, and this man was shell-shocked. So I think what is not that it's missing, but I think which we should be reminded of is when we feel the most powerless, I think we need to find who our neighbors are and go knock on their door and say, I don't know if I can help. Maybe there is something that you can help. They're packing medical supplies and other things and figuring out a way to ship it to the border and to Ukraine. Or maybe just listen, or maybe just let people express some of the grief and some of the pain. That's really also important.
Children are being put on trains to safety, a kind of modern kinder transport. We've been on trains. Michael, Olga, thank you so much. Rabbi Hessel, Zhenya, I turn it over to you.
Hello. So my story is a little bit different, and maybe I will be a little bit more emotional because I don't have strength to talk beautifully about the situation, because it's nothing beautiful about it. I'm from Kharkiv, and Kharkiv is city which is bombed now. I know that many people, like young people, capable to drive and to go to another place to start a new life, they were evacuated. But I want to say about people who cannot do this. I want to say about seniors who are stuck at their homes without food, without medicine, and they cannot go to any place because they cannot start the life from the beginning. They just cannot do this. And I know situations when people were dying because they don't have the access to water, to food, to insulin. And for me, it's a catastrophe. I worked for 17 years in Ukraine with different communities. I know people in Sumy, and now I read that like half of Sumy, they were ruined completely. I read about Irpin, it's a small town near Kiev, and it's just completely it's only parts of buildings. And for me, I cannot just read and think about political situation, about Putin who can use nuclear weapon. For me, the world is looking at the situation like Hunger Games, who will win, what will win, but it's not the situation when we can just look at it. We have to do something. We have to support Ukraine. We have to donate to different amazing organizations. And we have to call our congressmen and to ask no-fly zone because people are bombing. And I just read today about Mariupol, where maternity hospital was bombed, and small kids and women who were ready to give birth, they died. And it's not that you can just, it's not news, it's pain, it's bitterness, it's unbearable feeling. And I know that you came to listen to my song and not to listen to me talking, but for me, it's important to bring you the situation, what is unfolding in Ukraine. And Rabbi Farbman asked me to sing one song, and I think that this song is a very important song because it's a poetry by Mani Leib. This Yiddish poet was born in Nezhin in Ukraine, and he came to New York in order to become a famous Yiddish poet. I composed music for his song, and this song is about separation and pain. The person is saying, "Fly, fly, peacock, and bring greetings to my mom." But don't do this. Don't bring greetings to my mom because I don't want her to know my suffering. And for me, it's very close because my father died 1 month ago. He passed away in Kharkiv. And it's like a few minutes from the place where I saw on video a bomb which destroyed completely a building. And maybe I think that today his building is no more. And I'm happy that my father cannot see this. And this is a song about separation and suffering. Trog sich Pave, über weite Jahre, bring von mir gerissen zu meine lieber Mama, bring nicht zu meiner Mama, von mir kein gerissen. Besser von meinem Masel soll sie gar nicht wissen. Лети, Павло, hen над морями, неси, Павло, привіт, любій мамі. Неси їй, Павло, од мене знає, як живу, злиднем серед світу, як пізнає ненька, що зі мною стало, слізоньки дрібненькі впадуть, щоб не спала, день і ніч не спала, не спала й би не їла. Личка своє любе сльозами умила, буде в сльозах сивих горечко вмивати, візьмуть їх на кпини вороженькі кляті, не неси їй паво жодного привіту, хай не знає, як живу, злиднем серед світу. So maybe you noticed that I started from Yiddish and I came to Ukrainian language. I was a teacher of Yiddish for many years in Kharkiv and in Kiev, and one of my Ukrainian students, Sasha Uralova, after listening to this amazing Yiddish poetry, decided to translate it into Ukrainian language. And I think that the author, Mani Leib, he thought about this song as about Yiddish and Ukrainian together because it's a part of his Yiddish und Slavische Motiven cycle, but he definitely didn't think that this all will happen and that this song will transmit this pain and this bitterness.
Zhenya, thank you for your words and your music, and for being open to sharing both with all of us. On behalf of 92Y, I want to thank my colleague, Rabbi Michael Farbman, and his wonderful and talented wife, Olga Marcus, as well as Budd Mishkin and Zhenya Lopatnik for being with us. We thank you all. In 1 week's time, we'll be celebrating the holiday of Purim, which, albeit is a silly, topsy-turvy holiday, but one that speaks to the message of standing up for injustice. And so I conclude with this prayer. We pray for the safety of all in Ukraine. We pray for a peaceful resolution. We pray that the people affected have the strength and the resources to make it through this trying time. And most of all, we pray for the day when nations will beat their swords into plowshares and not learn war anymore. May it be your will. Amen. Thank you for joining us this evening.